The black sand of Istvan Fi drank deeply of blood that day, yet even in a galaxy grown accustomed to horror, few moments carried the weight of what transpired in those final seconds of brotherhood. The Dropsite massacre had unfolded exactly as Horus intended. Loyalist legions lay scattered and broken across the killing fields, yet in one corner of that vast graveyard, where the smoke of burning armor hung thick as funeral shrouds, a single figure knelt in the ashen dirt. Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's children, held the severed head of Ferrus Manus in his hands. The blade of the lair still hummed with satisfaction in his other hand, its demonic essence purring with the taste of Primarch blood. For months, the weapon had whispered to him, guiding him toward this moment of ultimate corruption. The daemon bound within the blade had promised that striking down the iron hand would seal his dedication to the Dark Prince forever. It had spoken of the ecstasy that would follow, the perfect sensation of a brother's life extinguished by fraternal steel. Yet as Fulgrim stared into Ferrus's lifeless eyes, no ecstasy came. Only a crushing weight that seemed to drive him deeper into the blood-soaked earth. The battlefield raged around him, but the sounds felt distant now, as though filtered through some terrible veil. Traitor Marines hunted down the last of the Loyalist survivors. The air cracked with bolt fire and the screams of the dying. Yet Fulgrim heard none of it. His world had contracted to the cold weight of his brother's head, and the demon's triumphant laughter echoing in his mind. "Magnificent," the demon whispered, its voice like silk drawn across a blade. "Do you feel it, my prince? The moment when love becomes murder, when perfection embraces corruption. This is what you were meant for. This is who you truly are." Fulgrim tried to answer, tried to share in the demon's glee, but the words would not come. Instead, something else rose within him. Not the expected rush of dark pleasure, but a revulsion so profound it felt like a physical blow. The head in his hands was not some abstract enemy. This was Ferrus, his brother, his closest friend among all the Primarchs. Memories flickered unbidden through his mind. The two of them as young gods, walking among the stars, competing in friendly rivalry over who could forge the finest blade. Ferrus's rare smile when Fulgrim had presented him with a weapon of such beauty that even the pragmatic iron hand had been moved to wonder. The countless battles they had fought side by side, not as primarchs serving the Emperor's grand design, but as brothers who trusted each other absolutely. "Stop!" the demon hissed, its voice taking on an edge of alarm. "Do not dwell on such weaknesses. Remember instead the glory of this moment. Remember the perfection of your blade work. He could not match you. He was flawed." Yet the revulsion only deepened. Fulgrim's fingers trembled as he traced the line of the wound he had carved across his brother's neck. So clean, so precise, the perfect cut, delivered with skill that exceeded even his own expectations. But perfection, he realized with dawning horror, was not supposed to taste like ash and poison. The demon pressed harder, flooding his mind with whispers of justification. Ferrus had chosen his fate. He had refused to join the liberation from the Emperor's tyranny. He had stood in the way of progress, of evolution, of the glorious future that Slaanesh offered. His death was not murder, but necessity, not betrayal, but enlightenment. Yet with each justification, Fulgrim felt something crack inside his soul, something the demon had not expected to encounter. For all its talk of perfection and transcendence, the creature had missed the one thing that had always driven Fulgrim above all others: his capacity to love. Love of beauty, yes. Love of art and perfection and the heights of achievement. But beneath it all, deeper than any corruption could reach, lay his love for his brothers. Not all of them, perhaps, but this one, this iron-handed giant who had seen past Fulgrim's vanity to something worth protecting. The daemon felt the shift and writhed in alarm. "No! You will not retreat from this. You cannot. The pact is sealed. The blood is spilled. You are mine." Fulgrim's grip tightened on Ferris's head, and for the first time since taking up the blade of the lair, he spoke words that were entirely his own. "I was yours, but I am not his killer." The paradox struck both of them like a thunderclap. The head in his hands was proof that he was indeed a killer. The blood on his blade confirmed his guilt beyond any doubt. Yet something in that admission of horror, that refusal to accept the demon's narrative of triumph, created a fissure in the creature's hold. The demon shrieked and pressed its influence harder, flooding his senses with phantom pleasures and artificial euphoria. It painted visions of what he could become, the heights of sensation he could achieve if he would only embrace what he had done. But for the first time in months, Fulgrim found the strength to turn away from those visions. Instead, he looked again at Ferris. Really looked. Not at a fallen enemy or a necessary sacrifice, but at his brother, his friend. The one person in all the galaxy who had understood that beneath Fulgrim's pursuit of perfection lay a desperate need to be worthy of the love he had been given. The tears that came then were not tears of ecstasy or corruption, but of simple, devastating grief. They fell on the iron mask that had covered Ferris's face, washing away the dust and blood to reveal the features beneath. Even in death, there was no anger there, no accusation, only the peace of someone who had died, believing he could save the brother he loved. "I remember," Fulgrim whispered, and the daemon recoiled as though struck. "I remember who I was before you came. I remember what we were to each other." The blade of the lair grew cold in his hand, its demon temporarily stunned by this unexpected resistance. Around them, the massacre continued its grim work, but in this small circle of grief, something had changed. The corruption that had seemed absolute was no longer complete. Fulgrim rose slowly, cradling his brother's head against his chest. The demon was not gone, not destroyed. It rallied quickly, filling his mind with threats and promises in equal measure. But the fissure had been opened. The crack in Slaanesh's perfect dominion had appeared. For the first time in months, Fulgrim remembered what it felt like to be himself, and he found that self to be a creature capable of fighting back. The sounds of the massacre grew distant as Fulgrim stumbled away from the killing ground. Ferris's head clutched against his chest like a sacred relic. His movements were erratic, purposeless, the gait of a warrior driven by pain rather than strategy. When Sergeant Castor of the Emperor's Children approached with concern etched across his scarred features, Fulgrim waved him away with a gesture that spoke of wounds deeper than flesh. "My lord, you are injured," Castor said, his voice carrying the worried deference of a son who had witnessed his father's apparent vulnerability for the first time. Fulgrim's response came through gritted teeth, each word a battle against the demon that raged within his skull. "The Iron Hand fought. Better than expected. I require solitude to tend my wounds." The lie tasted like poison, but it served its purpose. Castor withdrew, leaving orders for the Primarch's privacy to be respected. Alone at last, Fulgrim collapsed behind a shattered rhino transport, its ceramite hull still warm from the explosions that had torn it apart. The battlefield's chaos provided perfect cover for what was about to unfold. Not a battle of blade and bolt, but a war for the very essence of his soul. The daemon struck immediately, no longer content with whispered suggestions. It flooded his mind with waves of artificial euphoria, each one designed to drown the growing resistance in pleasurable submission. Fulgrim gasped as his nervous system lit up with sensations that had nothing to do with his physical form. Every nerve ending sang with impossible bliss. Every thought was wrapped in silk and honey. "You cannot fight what you have become," the demon purred, its voice now a symphony of temptation. "You killed him. You felt the blade part his flesh. You watched the light fade from his eyes. These are the moments that define us, my prince. There is no returning from such perfect corruption." Yet even as the demon's influence crashed over him like a tide of liquid ecstasy, Fulgrim found something to hold on to. A memory, sharp and clear as crystal, cutting through the haze of false pleasure. Ferrus standing in the forge caverns of Medusa, his massive hands working at a piece of raw metal with delicate precision that belied his brutal reputation. "You always make it look so effortless," Fulgrim had said, watching his brother shape the iron with nothing but hammer and will. Ferrus had looked up, surprise flickering across features that rarely showed emotion. Nothing worthwhile is effortless. That is why it matters. He had set down his hammer then, studying Fulgrim with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense to the truth beneath. "You know this better than most. Your pursuit of perfection is not about ease. It is about the struggle itself." The memory hit the daemon's assault like a shield wall meeting a cavalry charge. For a moment, the artificial pleasure faltered, and Fulgrim seized that moment with desperate strength. He pressed deeper into the recollection, using it as armor against the creature's influence. More memories followed, each one a small victory against the daemon's tide. Ferrus teaching him the proper way to temper a blade, not for show but for function. The two of them standing back to back during the cleansing of Gethsemane, trusting each other absolutely, as Xenos beasts circled like living nightmares. The rare occasions when Ferrus had laughed at one of Fulgrim's more outrageous displays of vanity, the sound rich and genuine in a way that made all the posturing worthwhile. "Sentiment!" the demon snarled, its voice taking on notes of frustration. "Weakness! These bonds you cling to are chains that have kept you from your true potential for too long. Remember instead how it felt when your blade found its mark. Remember the perfection of that moment." The demon's counterattack came not as pleasure, but as a replay of the killing stroke itself. Fulgrim felt his body moving through the motion again, felt the blade of the lair singing through the air with deadly precision. He experienced once more the moment when steel met flesh, when his brother's defenses crumbled before his superior skill. Yet where the demon expected triumph, Fulgrim found only greater horror. He saw now what he had missed in the heat of battle, too blinded by corruption to understand. Ferrus had seen the blow coming, had recognized it for what it was, a strike no loyal brother could have conceived, let alone executed. And in that final instant, as the blade descended, there had been no hatred in Ferrus's eyes, no anger or betrayal, only sadness. The grief of someone who understood that he was about to die, not at the hands of an enemy, but at the hands of a brother he had failed to save. "He knew," Fulgrim whispered, the words torn from his throat like shards of glass. "He knew what you had made me, and he came anyway. He tried to save me." The demon's shriek of rage was deafening inside his skull, a sound like breaking crystal and tearing silk. "He came to kill you, to drag you back to the Emperor's tyranny. His death was justice." Yet the more the demon protested, the clearer the truth became. Ferrus had not come to Istvan as a conqueror or an avenger. He had come as a brother, believing until the very end that the Fulgrim he remembered still existed somewhere beneath the corruption. Even as the blade fell, he had died, hoping he was wrong about what his brother had become. The realization hit Fulgrim like a physical blow, driving him to his knees in the ash and debris. But rather than weakness, he found in it a source of unexpected strength. Love, he realized, was not the soft sentiment the demon painted it to be. Love was the force that had driven Ferris to face impossible odds for the chance to save a brother. Love was what had made him refuse to give up hope, even as death claimed him. And love, Fulgrim discovered, was the one thing the daemon truly feared. "You are wrong," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Love is not weakness. It is the only strength that matters, and it is the one weapon you cannot corrupt." The demon's response was fury made manifest, a psychic assault that threatened to tear his mind apart at the seams. Pleasure and pain blurred together in a torrent designed to overwhelm all resistance. Yet Fulgrim held fast to his newfound understanding, using it as an anchor in the storm. He was not fighting for redemption or forgiveness. Those things might never come. He was fighting for something simpler and more profound. He was fighting to honor the love his brother had shown him, even unto death. He was fighting to prove that Ferris's faith in him had not been entirely misplaced. The battle was far from over. The demon was ancient and cunning, fed by the power of a god that thrived on excess and corruption. But for the first time since taking up the blade of the lyre, Fulgrim was truly fighting back, and in that resistance he found something he had thought lost forever. He found himself. The battle for Fulgrim's soul raged through the long hours, as Istvan the Fifth's twin sons began their descent toward the horizon. Behind the shattered hull of the rhino, the Primarch's body remained motionless, but within his mind, a war more crucial than any fought on the surface was reaching its turning point. The demon had grown desperate, its attacks becoming more frenzied as it sensed its hold slipping away. "You are nothing without me," it snarled, flooding his consciousness with images of his past glories. "Remember who you were before I elevated you. A vain peacock, obsessed with meaningless beauty, while your brothers won real victories. I gave you purpose. I gave you perfection." Yet in that desperate accusation, the demon had made a critical error. It had reminded Fulgrim of the one thing he valued above all else, the driving force that had defined him since his first breath on Chemos. Not vanity, not show, but the genuine pursuit of perfection itself. And for the first time since taking up the blade of the lair, Fulgrim truly examined what the demon called perfect. The massacre spread out before him. Thousands of his father's finest warriors lay dead or dying, betrayed by those they had trusted as brothers. The air reeked of burning flesh and ceramite, while the screams of the wounded echoed across the killing field. This was the demon's idea of perfection. This was what it had driven him to achieve. "No," Fulgrim said, his voice carrying a certainty that made the demon recoil. "This is not perfection. This is corruption, wearing perfection's mask." The revelation struck him with the force of a thunderbolt. All his life, he had pursued the ideal of flawless execution, of beauty married to function, of achieving something so pure and complete that it could stand as an eternal testament to what was possible. Yet everything the demon had led him toward was the opposite of that ideal. Betrayal was not perfect. It was the ultimate flaw. Murder was not beautiful. It was the destruction of beauty. Corruption was not transcendence. It was the abandonment of everything he had ever truly valued. "You lie!" the demon shrieked, its voice fracturing into harmonics of rage and fear. "I showed you pleasures beyond mortal comprehension. I gave you power that kings would die for, I made you more than human. You made me less, Fulgrim replied. And with those words, something crystallized in his mind. A space began to form, small at first, but growing stronger with each heartbeat. A sanctuary built not of walls and weapons, but of memories and principles that remained uncorrupted. He began with his earliest recollections of Chemos, when he had been nothing but a foundling child, learning to work metal in the deep forges. The satisfaction of shaping raw material into something useful and beautiful, the patient teaching of Master Kradek, who had shown him that true craftsmanship required not just skill, but integrity. The first blade he had forged with his own hands, imperfect by later standards, but honest in its making. The demon fought to corrupt these memories, to twist them into fuel for its own purposes. Yet Fulgrim held fast to their essential truth. They were his, not because they were grand or glorious, but because they were real. They belonged to the part of him that had existed before the corruption, the part that had genuinely sought to create rather than destroy. Layer by layer, he built his sanctuary, the first time he had seen true art on a civilized world, and wept at its beauty. The day he had been reunited with his father and felt the Emperor's approval wash over him like sunlight. The campaigns where he had fought not for conquest, but for liberation, bringing light to worlds shrouded in darkness. And always, at the center of it all, his friendship with Ferrus Manus. Not the idealized version the demon tried to paint as weakness, but the real bond between two beings who had understood each other perfectly. Ferrus, who had seen through Fulgrim's need for external validation to the desperate desire for acceptance beneath. Ferrus, who had never once asked him to be less than he was, only to be true to what he was. "This is my perfection," Fulgrim declared, and felt the demon's influence retreat like a tide rolling back from the shore. "Not the corruption you offered, but the purity I was meant to embody. Not power over others, but mastery over myself." The sanctuary solidified around him, a space within his own mind where the daemon's whispers could not penetrate. It was not large, and he knew it was still fragile, but it was his. For the first time in months, Fulgrim experienced true silence in his own thoughts. The constant background noise of temptation and corruption faded to a distant murmur, blocked by walls of genuine memory and honest purpose. From within this protected space, he could see the demon clearly for the first time. It was not the magnificent entity it pretended to be, not a source of transcendence or evolution. It was a parasite, feeding on his own drives and ambitions, twisting them into something monstrous. It had grown fat on his need for perfection, his desire for beauty, his love of his brothers. Yet it had never understood any of those things, only known how to corrupt them. "I see you now," Fulgrim whispered, and the diamond writhed in its prison of flesh and bone. "You are not my master. You are my mistake, and mistakes can be corrected." The creature's response was a howl of pure malice, but it was weaker now, diminished by its separation from the core of his being. It still had power, still had the ability to influence his actions when his guard was down. Yet it was no longer in control. The connection that had once seemed absolute was revealed to be anything but. Fulgrim opened his eyes to the physical world, seeing Istvan V's dying light with clarity that had been absent for too long. The massacre was ending. Bodies littered the ground like broken dolls, testament to the demon's idea of perfection. Yet for the first time since this nightmare began, he found himself able to think clearly about what came next. He could not undo what had been done. Ferrus was dead by his hand, and no amount of regret would bring him back. The Emperor's children had been corrupted under his watch, twisted into something that would have horrified the warriors they had once been. The damage was vast and perhaps irreparable. Yet damage, Fulgrim realized, was not the same as destruction. A flawed blade could be reforged. A corrupted work of art could be stripped back to its pure elements and recreated. Even a fallen Primarch, if he was willing to pay the necessary price, might find a path back to what he was meant to be. The daemon sensed his thoughts and pressed against the walls of his sanctuary, seeking any crack it could exploit. Yet the walls held firm, built as they were on foundations that predated its influence. For the first time since Lyre, Fulgrim began to plan not as the creature's puppet, but as himself. He would need to be careful. The demon was weakened, but not destroyed, and it would fight viciously to regain what it had lost. His legion was corrupted, and most would see any attempt at redemption as betrayal of the new gods they served. The other traitor Primarchs would not understand what he was trying to do, and the Loyalists would never trust him again. Yet for all those obstacles, Fulgrim felt something he had thought lost forever. Hope, not the false promise of transcendence the demon had offered, but the genuine possibility of earning back what he had thrown away. It would be the work of lifetimes, perhaps centuries. It would require sacrifices that would make his current suffering seem trivial. But it would be perfect in the truest sense of the word. Perfect because it was right. Perfect because it was his choice, made freely and without corruption. Perfect because it would honor the love his brother had shown him, even unto death. The path forward would be hard beyond imagining. Yet for the first time in longer than he cared to remember, Fulgrim looked forward to the challenge. The pride of the Emperor hung in the void above Istvan V, like a gleaming jewel, its hull unmarked by the violence that had stained the planet's surface. Aboard the flagship of the Emperor's children, preparations were underway for what Remembrancer Bekwa Kinska called her greatest work. The Maravilha, she proclaimed, would be a celebration of their liberation from the Emperor's stifling constraints. It would mark their true ascension into something greater than mere humanity. Fulgrim stood at the edge of the grand amphitheatre that had been constructed in the ship's largest cargo bay, watching his children make their final preparations. To any observer, he appeared as he always had, regal, confident, the very image of a Primarch who had embraced his destiny. Yet beneath that perfect facade, the battle for his soul continued with every heartbeat. The demon pressed against the walls of his mental sanctuary, seeking any crack it could exploit. "Look at them," it whispered, its voice honey-sweet with false affection. "See how eager they are to please you. They have prepared this magnificent celebration in your honor. Will you not at least watch?" Fulgrim's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He could sense the wrongness radiating from the preparations, like heat from a forge. The instruments being assembled were not mere tools of music, but something far more sinister. Each had been crafted according to specifications that owed nothing to human artistry, and everything to the corrupting influence that had infected his legion. "My lord," Captain Caesaron approached, his usually pristine armor showing subtle changes that spoke of accelerating corruption. Veins of gold and pink had begun to trace patterns across the ceramite, following designs that hurt to look upon directly. "The performance is ready to begin. Lady Kinska requests your presence in the seat of honor." For a moment, Fulgrim considered refusing, claiming some pressing tactical concern that required his immediate attention. Yet he knew that would only raise suspicions among those who expected their Primarch to revel in such displays of artistic excess. The facade had to be maintained, even if it meant witnessing horrors he could no longer participate in. "Of course," he said, his voice carrying just the right note of anticipation. I would not miss such a momentous occasion. As he took his designated place, Fulgrim's enhanced senses caught details that would have escaped mortal notice. The audience was not composed entirely of his Astartes. Dozens of mortal crew members had been gathered to witness the performance, their faces bright with anticipation that bordered on religious fervor. They had no idea what was about to unfold, no understanding of the trap that had been prepared for their souls. The demon stirred with excitement as the first notes began to play, its voice becoming a purr of satisfaction. Listen, my prince. Hear how perfectly they have learned our lessons. This is what your legion has become under our guidance. This is their true potential realized. Yet as the music swelled and began its insidious work on the minds of the audience, Fulgrim found himself fighting a very different battle. Within his sanctuary, he reached for memories of true music, genuine art that elevated rather than corrupted. The first time he had heard a choir on Terra, their voices rising in harmony that spoke of humanity's capacity for transcendence. The simple songs of the forge workers on Chemos, rough and unpolished but honest in their expression of shared purpose. The contrast between those memories and the abomination unfolding before him was stark enough to make his soul recoil. This was not art, but anti-art, a deliberate corruption of everything beautiful and meaningful. Where true music sought to unite hearts and minds in common purpose, this sought only to fragment and destroy. Around him, the first signs of corruption began to manifest among the audience. Mortal crew members swayed to rhythms that existed only in dimensions of unreality. Their eyes grew glassy with rapture that had nothing to do with genuine appreciation of beauty. Some began to weep tears of blood as their minds struggled to process sensations they were not meant to experience. Fulgrim's hands clenched into fists as he watched his children transform before his eyes. Astartes, who had once embodied the pinnacle of human achievement, writhed in ecstasy as alien influences rewrote the very fabric of their beings. Their armor began to change, growing spikes and organic curves that followed no human aesthetic. Their weapons shifted, taking on forms that would channel sound itself as a weapon of war. The demon laughed with delight as it witnessed the birth of the first noise marines. But Fulgrim felt only revulsion, so profound it threatened to crack the careful mask he wore. These were his sons, corrupted beyond recognition by influences he had failed to protect them from. Each transformation was a personal failure, a mark of shame that cut deeper than any blade. Yet even as the horror unfolded around him, Fulgrim began to identify those who seemed less affected by the performance. A handful of his warriors stood rigid in their places, their faces set in expressions of dutiful attention that barely concealed their revulsion. They were fighting the influence, just as he was, and they were losing. Captain Rylanor of the Ancient of Rites stood among them, his scarred features carved from stone as he witnessed the destruction of everything he had sworn to protect. Sergeant Kallimos clutched his bolter with white-knuckled intensity, his enhanced physiology struggling to filter toxins that were as much spiritual as chemical. A dozen others showed similar signs of resistance, islands of clarity in a sea of corruption. These were the ones he could save, if he acted carefully. These were the Emperor's children, who might yet remember what they had once been. The demon sensed his thoughts and pressed harder against his mental defenses, flooding his consciousness with artificial pleasure designed to overwhelm his resistance. "Do not think to steal my children from me," it snarled, its voice taking on harmonics that matched the hideous symphony playing out before them. "They are mine now, as you are mine. Accept what they have become and rejoice in their transformation." Yet Fulgrim's sanctuary held firm, built as it was on foundations the demon could not corrupt. From within that protected space, he began to plan. Not openly, not in any way that would reveal his change of heart, but with the careful patience of a master strategist. He would need to identify every warrior who showed signs of resistance. He would need to find ways to separate them from the corruption without alerting the daemon to his intentions. Most challenging of all, he would need to maintain his facade of corruption while working to save whatever fragments of his legion remained pure. As the Maraviglia reached its crescendo, reality itself seemed to waver around the performers. The instruments had fused with their players, becoming hybrid abominations that channeled the very essence of excess into devastating sonic attacks. The mortal crew members who had not been driven mad by the experience lay dead or dying, their minds shattered by exposure to truths they were never meant to comprehend. Fulgrim rose from his seat as the final notes faded, leading the applause with exactly the degree of enthusiasm his corrupted persona would have shown. Yet even as he played his part, his enhanced perception catalogued every detail, every survivor, every possible avenue for salvation. "Magnificent," he declared, his voice carrying across the amphitheatre. "Lady Kinska, you have exceeded even my expectations. This performance will be remembered for eternity." The demon preened at the praise, mistaking his performance for genuine appreciation. Yet Fulgrim was already thinking ahead, planning the careful steps that would be required to save what could be saved. The corruption of his legion was far advanced, but it was not yet complete. In the handful of warriors who had resisted the Maraviglia's influence, he saw the seeds of something that might yet grow into redemption. The path ahead would require sacrifices that would test him to his very limits. He would need to watch more of his children fall to corruption while appearing to celebrate their transformation. He would need to make choices that would seem like betrayals to those he was trying to save. Most difficult of all, he would need to trust that love and loyalty could triumph over corruption, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. Yet as he looked upon the survivors of the Maraviglia, Fulgrim felt something he had thought lost forever stir within his chest. Hope. Not for himself, perhaps, but for those who might yet be saved from the fate that had claimed so many. It was a fragile thing, delicate as spun glass and twice as precious. The demon would fight him every step of the way, he knew. It would use every weapon in its arsenal to prevent him from reclaiming what had been lost. Yet for the first time since Lair, Fulgrim looked forward to that battle. He had found his purpose again, not as a conqueror or a destroyer, but as a protector of those who could not protect themselves. The war for his legion's soul was about to begin in earnest. The hunting began 3 days after the Maraviglia, when the pride of the Emperor was deep in the void between systems, and the corruption had settled into its new patterns like poison soaking into cloth. Fulgrim moved through the ship's corridors in the hours before dawn shift, when the artificial lighting dimmed to simulate planetary cycles, and most of his legion sought rest. To any observer, he was conducting routine inspections, the sort of detail-oriented leadership his officers had come to expect from their perfectionist Primarch. Yet the Emperor's child who did not return from those inspections told a different story. Brother Corvain had been among the first to fully embrace the changes wrought by the Maraviglia. His armor now bore organic curves that pulsed with unnatural life, and the sonic weaponry fused to his arm fired notes of such perfect discord that they could shatter ceramite with their harmony. He had laughed as mortal crew members died during the performance, their minds too fragile to appreciate the new forms of beauty his legion was exploring. When Fulgrim found him in the weapon practice chambers, perfecting techniques that owed nothing to human martial disciplines, Corvain had greeted his Primarch with eager anticipation. Here was validation from the Gene Father himself, acknowledgement that his transformation was worthy of praise. Instead, he found death delivered by hands that moved faster than enhanced reflexes could track. Not the quick, clean death of the battlefield, but something surgical and precise. Fulgrim dismantled the corruption piece by piece, studying each aberrant modification with the eye of someone who understood exactly how to unmake what should never have been made. "Why do you resist?" the demon snarled, as Fulgrim disposed of the evidence with methodical care. "He was your child, and I made him perfect. You should be celebrating his transcendence, not murdering it." Fulgrim's response came through gritted teeth as he incinerated the last traces of Corvain's corrupted flesh. He was never perfect. He was a mistake wearing perfection's face, and mistakes must be corrected. The demon's retaliation was swift and vicious. Pain exploded through Fulgrim's nervous system, not the clean agony of physical injury, but something far more insidious. His vision blurred, his hands shook, and for several terrifying minutes he felt control of his own body slipping away like water through cupped fingers. When awareness returned, he found himself standing over the corpse of another emperor's child, this one barely corrupted at all. Brother Thessarius had been among those who showed signs of resistance during the Maravilla, one of the warriors Fulgrim had marked for potential salvation. Now he lay dead, his throat opened by the Primarch's own hands, while the demon wore his flesh like a borrowed coat. The sight hit Fulgrim with the force of a thunderbolt, driving him to his knees beside the fallen warrior. The demon had used his moment of weakness to strike at those he sought to protect, turning his own strength against everything he held sacred. It was a reminder that his enemy was not merely present, but actively malevolent, willing to destroy what he loved most in order to maintain its hold over him. Yet even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Fulgrim found unexpected strength in the horror. If the demon was willing to kill potential allies, that meant it truly feared what he was attempting. His resistance was not futile gesturing, but a genuine threat to the creature's plans. That knowledge, bitter as it was, gave him the resolve to continue. The hunt resumed with greater care. Fulgrim learned to recognize the warning signs that preceded the demon's attempts at control, the subtle shifts in perception that announced its gathering strength. He developed techniques for reinforcing his mental sanctuary even as he moved through the ship, building walls of memory and purpose that could withstand sudden assault. More importantly, he began to identify allies among his legion's survivors. Captain Saul Tarvitz was the first and most obvious choice, a warrior whose loyalty to the Emperor had never wavered, even as corruption spread through the ranks around him. When Fulgrim found him in the Strategium, studying fleet movements with the focused attention of someone seeking patterns in chaos, the Primarch felt a surge of hope he had thought lost forever. "My lord," Tarvitz said, rising from his contemplation of the hololithic displays. His armor still bore the purple and gold of the Emperor's children, but it remained unmarked by the organic growths and sonic weaponry that had infected so many of his brothers. "I was reviewing our current position. We appear to be moving toward the Purdus Rift." Fulgrim nodded, though his attention was focused not on tactical concerns, but on the subtle signs that marked Tarvitz as uncorrupted. The captain's eyes remained clear and focused, unmarked by the glassy euphoria that characterized those fully under Slaanesh's influence. His movements retained the precise economy that spoke of uncompromised discipline. Most telling of all, he spoke of duty and strategy rather than sensation and excess. "Tell me, Captain," Fulgrim said carefully, "what do you think of the changes we have undergone since Istvan?" The question hung in the air between them, like a blade waiting to fall. Tarvitz was silent for a long moment, his scarred features revealing nothing of the thoughts racing behind his eyes. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who had chosen his path despite knowing the cost. "I think we have lost our way, my lord. The warriors I see in our ranks are not the Emperor's children I once knew. They seek sensation where they should seek victory, pleasure where they should seek purpose. If this is evolution, then perhaps some things should not evolve." It was treason by the standards of the new order Horus was building. Yet to Fulgrim, it sounded like the first honest words he had heard in months. Here was someone who saw the corruption for what it truly was, who mourned the loss of what they had once been. Here was an ally worth any risk. "Your observations are astute," Fulgrim said, choosing his words with care. Even with Tarvitz, he could not reveal the full extent of his transformation. The demon was always listening, always watching for signs of betrayal. "Perhaps there are others who share your concerns." Tarvitz's eyes sharpened with something that might have been hope. "There are, my lord. Not many, but some. Captain Rillanor speaks often of the old ways. Sergeant Kalimos has been asking difficult questions about our current course. A few others remain who remember what we swore to protect." The demon stirred uneasily at this exchange, pressing against Fulgrim's mental defenses with increasing agitation. Yet the Primarch held firm, using techniques he had developed through nights of careful practice. The sanctuary within his mind had grown stronger with each passing day, its walls reinforced by the memories of those he sought to save. Over the following weeks, Fulgrim began to build a network of the uncorrupted within his own legion. It was dangerous work that required absolute discretion. Each contact had to be approached carefully, tested for signs of corruption or potential betrayal. The demon fought him at every step, attempting to reassert control whenever his guard was lowered. The price of those battles was visible to those who knew how to look. Fulgrim's perfect features began to show signs of strain, subtle lines that spoke of internal conflict. His movements occasionally betrayed the tremor of someone fighting wars on multiple fronts. Most telling of all, there were moments when his eyes seemed to burn with inner fire, as though some terrible struggle was being fought behind them. Yet progress was made. Sergeant Kalimos was brought into the circle, then Techmarine Fabius, then a handful of others who had resisted the call of excess. They met in secret, using maintenance schedules and routine inspections as cover for discussions that would have been considered high treason by any corrupted observer. Plans began to take shape, not for immediate action, but for the larger betrayal that would eventually be required. They would need to identify targets among the most corrupted, eliminate them without raising suspicion, and establish contact with loyalist forces when the opportunity arose. Most critically, they would need to time their revelation perfectly, striking when maximum damage could be done to Horus's cause. It was Captain Tarvitz who suggested the most audacious element of their strategy. "The other traitor legions trust us because they believe us fully corrupted. If we could maintain that facade until a critical moment, feed them false intelligence, or sabotage their operations from within." Fulgrim felt the demon's rage like acid in his veins, but he forced himself to nod thoughtfully. "A dangerous game, Captain. One mistake and we would all be dead." "Yes, my lord. But the potential gains are enormous. We could cripple the traitors' efforts from within, perhaps even turn the tide of the war itself." As they spoke, Fulgrim felt something he had thought lost forever begin to grow within his chest. Not hope for his own redemption, which might never come, but hope for something larger. Hope that the mistakes of Istvan could be balanced by sacrifices yet to be made. hope that even the most corrupted could find a path back to honor if they were willing to pay the price. The demon sensed his growing determination and redoubled its efforts to reassert control. Yet Fulgrim's sanctuary held firm, strengthened by the bonds of loyalty he was forging with those who remained true. For the first time since taking up the blade of the lair, he began to believe that victory might actually be possible. The secret war had begun in earnest, and its outcome would determine not just the fate of the Emperor's children, but the future of the galaxy itself. The chamber chosen for the revelation was deep within the pride of the Emperor's bowels, a maintenance bay that serviced the ship's primary plasma conduits. The constant thrum of the reactor core masked voices from surveillance systems, while the maze of pipes and machinery provided cover from unwanted observers. Captain Sol Tarvitz arrived first, his hand resting unconsciously on his bolt pistol as he surveyed the cramped space with the wariness of a veteran who had learned to trust nothing completely. Captain Rillanor followed, his ancient frame moving with the careful precision of someone who had seen too many battles and lived to tell of them. Sergeant Kalimos came next, then Techmarine Fabius, each man arriving at carefully staggered intervals to avoid drawing attention. They were the core of the resistance Fulgrim had built over weeks of careful cultivation, warriors who had proven themselves capable of seeing past the corruption that had claimed so many of their brothers. When Fulgrim himself finally entered the chamber, the assembled warriors immediately recognized that something fundamental had changed in their Primarch. The perfection they had always associated with him seemed fractured somehow, as though an invisible war was being fought behind eyes that burned with unnatural intensity. His movements carried a tension that spoke of constant struggle, and when he spoke, his voice held harmonics that seemed to come from multiple sources. "What I'm about to tell you will sound like madness," Fulgrim began, his words measured and precise, despite the tremor that ran through his hands. "You will be tempted to believe that your gene father has finally succumbed to the same corruption that has claimed so many of our brothers. I ask only that you listen before you judge." Tarvitz straightened, his scarred features revealing nothing of the thoughts racing behind his eyes. "We are listening, my lord." The demon stirred within Fulgrim's consciousness, sensing the danger inherent in this gathering. Yet the Primarch pressed forward, drawing strength from the sanctuary he had built within his mind. "I am possessed," he said, the words falling like hammer blows in the confined space. "A demon of Slaanesh has taken residence within my soul, feeding on my desires for perfection and twisting them into instruments of corruption." The silence that followed was deafening. Relenor's ancient features remained carved from stone, while Kalimos unconsciously shifted his weight toward the chamber's exit. Fabius tilted his head, as though analyzing the revelation from multiple angles, his augmetic implants whirring softly as they processed the implications. It was Tarvitz who broke the silence, his voice carefully controlled. "How long, my lord?" "Since Lyre," Fulgrim replied, and saw understanding dawn in the captain's eyes. "The blade I claimed from that world carried more than mere metal and ceramite. It was a prison, and I was fool enough to become its new host." The demon's response to this revelation was immediate and violent. Pain exploded through Fulgrim's nervous system. Not the clean agony of physical injury, but something that attacked the very core of his being. His body convulsed as invisible forces tore at his consciousness, and for a terrifying moment, the assembled warriors saw their Primarch's face twist into something inhuman. When the spasm passed, Fulgrim found himself on his knees, crimson tears streaming down his cheeks. The taste of copper filled his mouth, and he could feel the demon's rage burning like acid in his veins. Yet he had held fast to his sanctuary, maintaining enough control to speak the truth, despite the creature's fury. "As you can see," he said, wiping the blood from his lips with hands that shook despite his best efforts, "the creature does not appreciate being exposed." Tarvitz moved forward, his bolt pistol drawn but pointed away from his Gene father. "My lord, if what you say is true, then how can we trust anything you tell us? How do we know that this is not some elaborate deception orchestrated by the demon itself?" The question cut to the heart of Fulgrim's dilemma, and he felt a moment of despair at the impossible nature of his situation. How could he prove his sincerity to warriors who had every reason to doubt him? How could he demonstrate the authenticity of his resistance when his very existence was compromised by forces beyond mortal comprehension? Yet the answer came not from logic, but from memory. Rising slowly to his feet, Fulgrim began to speak of things only the true Primarch could know. Private conversations with each of the assembled warriors, moments of doubt and triumph that had been shared between Gene father and son in the years before corruption took hold. He spoke of Tarvitz's first command, when the young captain had disobeyed direct orders to save a company of Imperial Guard from orbital bombardment. He recounted Rilena's vigil over a fallen battle brother during the cleansing of Gethsemane, maintaining guard for 3 days, while Xenos predators circled like vultures. With each memory, the assembled warriors felt their doubt begin to crumble. These were not things a demon could simply pluck from surface thoughts or battlefield reports. They were the intimate moments that defined the bonds between father and sons, forged in blood and brotherhood over decades of shared service. "I remember," Kalimos said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You spoke to me after Thessaly Prime, when I lost half my squad to that cursed Xenos weapon. You told me that grief was the price we pay for caring about something greater than ourselves." Fulgrim nodded, feeling a moment of genuine peace as he saw acceptance replace suspicion in the sergeant's eyes. "The diamond feeds on my memories, twists them into fuel for its corruption. But it cannot understand them, cannot appreciate what made them precious. That is its weakness and our opportunity." Rylanor stepped forward, his ancient features set in grim determination. "What would you have us do, my lord? How do we fight an enemy that wears our father's face?" The demon pressed against Fulgrim's mental defenses, seeking any crack it could exploit to reassert control. Yet the Primarch held firm, strengthened by the support of those who had chosen to believe in him, despite every rational reason for doubt. "We wage war on multiple fronts," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Against the corruption within our ranks, against the demon that seeks to control me, and against Horus himself when the moment is right." Fabius raised a hand, his augmetic eye focusing on his Primarch with mechanical precision. "The technical challenges alone are staggering. How do we coordinate resistance activities while maintaining operational security? How do we identify targets without alerting the corrupted to our activities?" "Carefully," Fulgrim replied, and for the first time in months he felt something approaching his old confidence. "We begin by establishing secure communication protocols with loyalist forces. Not direct contact, which would be too dangerous, but dead drops and coded transmissions that can convey intelligence without revealing our true allegiance." Tarvitz nodded slowly, his tactical mind already working through the implications. "We would need to be extremely selective about our targets. Any action we take must appear to serve the traitor cause while actually undermining it." "Precisely. We walk a knife's edge between revelation and deception, between service and sabotage. One misstep and we all die, along with any hope of redemption for our legion." The demon's fury at this planning session was palpable, a constant pressure against Fulgrim's consciousness that threatened to overwhelm his defenses. Yet for the first time since Istvan, he no longer fought alone. The knowledge that these warriors stood with him, that they understood the stakes and were willing to risk everything for the chance at redemption, gave him strength he had thought lost forever. Over the following hours, plans began to take shape. They would establish a network of safe houses and communication routes throughout the fleet. They would identify the most corrupted elements within the Legion and eliminate them under cover of routine disciplinary actions. Most importantly, they would begin the delicate process of reaching out to loyalist forces, offering intelligence in exchange for the chance to prove their renewed allegiance to the Emperor. It was dangerous beyond measure, a gambit that could result in the destruction of everything they held dear. Yet as Fulgrim looked upon the faces of his loyal sons, he felt something he had thought destroyed forever begin to stir within his chest. Not the false promise of transcendence the daemon had offered, but genuine hope for redemption earned through sacrifice and struggle. The demon might wear his flesh and speak with his voice, but his soul remained his own. And with allies who understood the stakes, he finally had a chance to prove that even the most corrupted could find a path back to the light. The revelation was complete, and the real war was about to begin. The strike began in the depths of the night cycle, when the pride of the Emperor drifted silent through the void and most of its crew sought rest in their quarters. Fulgrim moved through the ship's corridors like a ghost given form, the blade of the lair singing its demon song in his grip, while his loyal sons spread throughout the vessel on missions that would either save their legion or damn them all. Captain Tarvitz led the assault on the Maraviglia chamber, where the most corrupted of their brothers had gathered to perfect new forms of sonic warfare. The noise marines they had become were no longer recognizable as the Emperor's children who had once served with such distinction. Their armor pulsed with organic growths that channeled sound itself as a weapon, while their faces bore expressions of such rapture that they seemed lost to all mortal concerns. The battle erupted without warning, bolt rounds and sonic blasts painting the chamber in light and fury. Tarvitz ducked behind a pillar as harmonics sharp enough to cut ceramite shattered the air around him, the sound of his own breathing drowned by the horrible music his former brothers created. Yet he pressed forward, knowing that hesitation meant death not just for himself, but for the fragile hope of redemption they all carried. 3 decks above, Captain Rylanor fought a very different battle in the Legion's armory. The corrupted weapons stored there had begun to change under Slaanesh's influence, their machine spirits twisted into something that hungered for sensation rather than simple destruction. Each blade and bolt pistol had become a potential gateway for demonic influence, and Rylanor's task was to destroy them before they could spread their corruption further. His chain-axe bit deep into metal that screamed like living flesh, each cut releasing sounds that should never have emerged from crafted steel. The ancient captain's face remained carved from stone as he worked, methodically destroying centuries of accumulated weaponry with the patience of someone who understood that some things were too dangerous to preserve. Yet it was in his own chambers that Fulgrim faced the greatest challenge, for the daemon within him had finally understood what was happening and marshaled all its remaining power for a final, desperate assault. As his loyal sons fought throughout the ship, the Primarch found himself locked in combat with enemies that wore the faces of his closest advisors, but carried the essence of creatures born in the warp's deepest hells. Lord Commander Eidolon stood before him, or something that had once been Eidolon before. Corruption hollowed out everything human and filled the shell with Slaaneshi hunger. His armor had become a living instrument of torment, each plate capable of producing sounds that could drive lesser beings to madness. When he spoke, his words carried harmonics that bypassed the ears entirely and attacked the soul. Why do you resist perfection, Gene Father? The thing that had been Eidolon asked, its voice a symphony of pleasure and pain. We have transcended the limitations of mere mortality. We have become art given form, music made manifest. Join us willingly, and know ecstasy beyond mortal comprehension. Fulgrim's response was the blade of the lair cutting through the air in an arc that would have decapitated any mortal opponent. Yet Eidolon moved with inhuman grace, his corrupted form flowing like liquid around the Primarch's strike. The battle that followed was less combat than deadly dance, each movement choreographed by forces that sought to seduce as much as to destroy. The demon within the blade sang its approval as Fulgrim fought, feeding on the violence and seeking to use it as a gateway to total possession. Yet the Primarch held firm to his sanctuary, drawing strength from the knowledge that his loyal sons were fighting their own battles throughout the ship. He was no longer alone in his struggle, and that knowledge gave him power the demon had never encountered. You cannot hold us back forever, the creature that wore Eidolon's face taunted as it dodged another strike. We are eternal, while you are merely mortal. Time favors our cause, not yours. Yet even as it spoke, the sounds of battle began to shift throughout the ship. Tarvitz's assault on the Maravilla chamber was succeeding, the sonic weapons falling silent one by one as their corrupted wielders were cut down by disciplined bolt fire. Rilenor's methodical destruction of tainted weaponry was removing another source of demonic influence. Across a dozen fronts, the loyal Emperor's children were winning victories that collectively weakened the hold Slaanesh maintained over their legion. The diamond in the blade felt each loss like a physical blow, its voice changing from triumphant song to desperate shriek. Fulgrim seized upon that weakness, pressing his attack with renewed vigor, while the creature within his weapon grew weaker with each passing moment. "I feel your fear," he said, driving the blade toward Eidolon's corrupted heart. "You thought yourself invincible, but you are learning the truth. Love is stronger than corruption. Brotherhood transcends possession, and loyalty endures long after pleasure has faded to dust." The strike connected, and Eidolon's scream was a sound that had never been meant for human throats. Yet even as the corrupted Lord Commander fell, Fulgrim felt the demon within the Blade Marshal its remaining power for one final gambit. Pain beyond description flooded his nervous system as the creature sought to override his will through sheer agony, to use his moment of triumph as the gateway to ultimate defeat. Instead, Fulgrim did something the demon had never expected. Rather than fight the pain or try to shield himself from it, he embraced it. He allowed the agony to flow through him while holding fast to the love that had started his rebellion. The pain became a purifying fire that burned away everything false, everything corrupted, leaving only the essential core of what he had always been. The blade of the lair began to crack in his grip, hairline fractures spreading across metal that had seemed indestructible. The demon's screams grew louder as its prison began to fail, the weapon that had been its gateway into reality becoming the instrument of its banishment. "This is not possible!" it shrieked, its voice fracturing into harmonics of pure terror. "I am eternal. I am perfection, given form. You cannot destroy what I have made." "I am not destroying anything," Fulgrim replied, his voice calm despite the cosmic forces tearing at his soul. "I am correcting a mistake. I am returning you to the void where you belong." The blade shattered completely, its fragments dissolving into motes of light that faded like dying stars. The demon's final scream echoed through dimensions of reality that had no names, a sound of rage and loss that would haunt the warp for millennia to come. Yet victory came at a price that threatened to break Fulgrim's spirit even as it freed his soul. The daemon's destruction had not been complete, could never be complete while any trace of corruption remained in his flesh. Part of the creature's essence had become so intertwined with his being that removing it entirely would have meant his death. He was free of its direct control, but not of its influence, changed, but not redeemed, something between mortal and demon, human and monster. When the battle ended and his loyal sons gathered in his chambers, they found a primarch who was recognizably their gene father, yet fundamentally transformed. His features remained perfect, but they now carried an otherworldly quality that spoke of forces beyond mortal comprehension. His eyes burned with fires that belonged to no earthly source, and when he moved, reality itself seemed to bend around him. "My lord," Tarvitz said carefully, his voice heavy with concern. "How do you feel?" Fulgrim considered the question for a long moment, taking inventory of the changes that had been wrought within his being. The demon's voice was gone, its constant whispers finally silenced. Yet he could still feel its essence woven through his soul like threads of poison through pure silk. He was himself again, but he was also something more and something less than what he had been. "I am free," he said at last, and the words carried harmonics that made the air itself vibrate with power. Not completely, perhaps, but free enough to choose my own path, free enough to fight for what I believe in, free enough to earn the redemption that can never simply be given. The cost of their victory was written in the bodies that littered the ship's corridors. Dozens of Emperor's children lay dead, some corrupted beyond salvation, others who had died defending the possibility of their legion's redemption. Yet for the first time since Istvan, Fulgrim felt something approaching hope. They had proven that Slaanesh's influence could be resisted, that corruption could be fought, and sometimes even defeated. The war was far from over. The greater demon might be banished, but its master still reigned supreme in the warp, and there were other forces of corruption that would seek to reclaim what had been lost. Yet they had taken the first step on a path that might eventually lead to true redemption. The Primarch who emerged from that battle was not the same being who had entered it. Yet he was closer to what he had always been meant to be. Not a perfect god prince, but a leader who understood that true perfection lay not in the absence of flaws, but in the endless struggle to overcome them. The retaliation came 3 days after the blade of the Layer's destruction, when the pride of the Emperor drifted in the shadow of a dead moon, and the surviving Emperor's children counted their losses from the battle that had freed their Primarch. The warp around them began to convulse with unnatural energies, reality bending and twisting as something vast and malevolent focused its attention upon the ship and those who had dared to defy its will. Captain Tarvitz felt it first, a pressure against his consciousness that spoke of powers beyond mortal comprehension. The air itself grew thick with the taste of copper and honey, while shadows moved in directions that had no names in any human tongue. He found Fulgrim in the Primarch's chambers, standing before the shattered remains of what had once been the Maravillas stage, his transformed features set in grim determination as he prepared for what was to come. "My lord," Tarvitz said, his hand instinctively moving toward his bolt pistol, despite knowing it would be useless against what approached. "The augurs are detecting massive warp disturbances. Something is coming." Fulgrim nodded, his eyes burning with fires that belonged to no earthly source. The partial exorcism had left him changed in ways that defied easy description, neither fully mortal nor completely touched by the divine. He could feel Slaanesh's rage pressing against the barriers of reality, seeking entry into the material realm where its fury could find proper expression. "She comes herself," he said, and Tarvitz felt his blood freeze at the casual use of that pronoun. Not in physical form, for even her power cannot breach the barriers between worlds so easily, but her servants can, and they carry her wrath with them. The first breach opened in the ship's lower decks, reality tearing like wet paper to admit creatures that should never have existed in any sane universe. Greater demons of Slaanesh poured through the wound in space, their forms shifting between beauty and horror with each heartbeat. They moved with inhuman grace, leaving trails of impossible colors in the air as they hunted through the corridors for those who had betrayed their mistress. Yet even as Fulgrim's loyal sons rallied to defend their ship, a more insidious threat revealed itself. The astropathic communications array crackled to life, carrying messages from other elements of the traitor fleet. Word had spread of the Emperor's children's actions, and the response was swift and merciless. "Lord Fulgrim," came the voice of Captain Ezekiel Abaddon, his words carrying the cold authority of one who spoke for the War Master himself. "You will surrender yourself and your corrupted legion for judgment. Your recent actions have been deemed counterproductive to our cause. Compliance is not optional." The trap was closing from all sides. Slaanesh's demons attacked from within, while Horus's forces surrounded them from without. The loyal Emperor's children found themselves caught between two forms of damnation, with no hope of escape and little chance of survival. Fulgrim gathered his remaining captains in the strategium, where hololithic displays showed the approaching fleets in stark detail. Sons of Horus cruisers moved to attack positions, while word-bearers' vessels prepared boarding actions. The noose was tightening, and there would be no mercy for those who had dared to resist the new order. "They offer us a choice," Fulgrim said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself vibrate with power. "Surrender to Abaddon's judgment, or face the consequences of our defiance. Yet we know what either option means. Death for those who followed me, and eternal torment for any who survive." Captain Ryllanor stepped forward, his ancient features carved from stone as he studied the tactical displays. "Our shields are failing under the Daemon assault, and we lack the firepower to break through the blockade. Unless we can find another solution, this ship will become our tomb." It was then that Fulgrim made the decision that would define the rest of his existence. Looking upon the faces of his loyal sons, warriors who had risked everything to follow him back from the brink of damnation, he felt a peace he had not known since before Leia. They had given him their trust, their loyalty, their lives. Now it was time to repay that gift with the ultimate sacrifice. "There is another way," he said, moving toward the chamber's center, where the ship's Vox system would carry his words throughout the fleet. "A Primarch's life is worth more than those of his sons. If I offer myself in exchange for your freedom, perhaps even Abaddon will see the value in that bargain." "No," Tarvitz said immediately, his voice thick with emotion. "My lord, we did not fight to free you from one form of slavery, only to watch you surrender to another. There must be some other option." Yet Fulgrim had already made his choice, and the demon blood that now flowed through his veins gave him power that you could comprehend. He reached out with senses that extended beyond the physical realm, touching the minds of every loyal Emperor's child aboard the ship. In that moment of contact, he shared with them a fraction of his transformed nature, marking their souls with protections that would shield them from the worst of what was to come. "Remember me not as the corrupted fool who fell to Slaanesh's whispers," he said, his words reaching every corner of the ship through both vox and psychic transmission. "Remember me as someone who learned that love is stronger than corruption, that loyalty transcends death, and that even the most fallen can find a path to redemption if they are willing to pay the price." The Daemon assault reached its crescendo as Fulgrim opened himself to powers that no mortal form was meant to contain. His physical body began to burn with energies drawn from sources beyond the material realm, becoming a conduit for forces that threatened to tear reality itself apart. The greater demons that had invaded his ship screamed as his transformed essence struck them like a tide of purifying fire, banishing them back to the warp with violence that left the very air crackling with residual energy. Yet the effort cost him everything. His physical form dissolved into motes of light that danced like dying stars, his consciousness scattering across dimensions that had no names in any human tongue. To those who watched, it appeared that their Primarch had simply ceased to exist, his sacrifice buying them the precious seconds they needed to escape, while the traitor fleets reeled from the psychic shockwave of his dissolution. Captain Tarvitz took command of the evacuation, his voice steady despite the tears that streamed down his scarred cheeks. "All hands abandon ship. Execute Dispersal Protocol 7. We scatter to the void and pray that our Gene Father's sacrifice was not in vain." The loyal Emperor's children fled in small groups, using the confusion caused by Fulgrim's final act to slip away into the darkness between stars. They believed their Primarch dead, destroyed by his own power, in a desperate attempt to save them from the consequences of their defiance. Yet death was not the end of Fulgrim's story. His consciousness, fragmented but not destroyed, drifted through realms that existed between the material universe and the warp. He was neither fully alive nor completely dead, but something new and strange that had never existed before. The demon's essence still clung to fragments of his being like poison in a wound, yet it no longer controlled him. He was free to choose his own path, even if that path led through valleys of shadow and uncertainty. In that liminal space between existence and oblivion, Fulgrim began to understand the true nature of his transformation. He had become something unprecedented in the galaxy's long history, a being that embodied the possibility of redemption even for the most corrupted souls. His sacrifice had not ended his story, but transformed it into something larger than any single life. The loyal Emperor's children scattered to the far corners of the galaxy, carrying with them the memory of a Primarch who had chosen love over corruption, sacrifice over survival. They did not know that their Gene Father still existed in a form beyond their understanding, or that his fractured consciousness was already planning the next phase of a war that would span millennia. Slaanesh's fury at this defiance would burn for eons, yet the Dark Prince had learned a costly lesson. Even the most corrupted could find a path back to the light, and that knowledge would haunt the Chaos Gods until the stars themselves burned out. The price of defiance had been paid in full, but the story was far from over. The reconstitution began in the spaces between thoughts, where consciousness exists without form and will shapes reality through pure intention. For 7 years, Fulgrim's scattered essence had drifted through dimensions that knew neither time nor substance, slowly gathering the fragments of what he had been while learning to accept what he was becoming. The demon's corruption still clung to parts of his being, like poison in a healing wound, yet it no longer controlled him. He was something unprecedented in the galaxy's history, a soul that had chosen redemption over damnation, and paid the price in transformation beyond mortal comprehension. The first sign of his return came to Captain Saul Tarvitz as he led a desperate raid against word-bearer positions in the ruins of Calth. The loyal Emperor's children had scattered after their Primarch's sacrifice, fighting a guerrilla war against the traitor forces while struggling to find meaning in a galaxy that had branded them heretics, regardless of their true allegiance. When the air began to shimmer with energies that belonged to no known science, Tarvitz felt his blood freeze in recognition of something both familiar and utterly alien. Light erupted from empty space, not the harsh glare of plasma fire or the sickly radiance of the warp, but something pure and terrible that made the very atoms sing with joy. The illumination coalesced into a figure that stood 7 feet tall, its form shifting between perfect human beauty and something that transcended mortal categories entirely. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that reached directly into the souls of those who heard it. "My sons," Fulgrim said, and Tarvitz fell to his knees as recognition crashed over him like a tidal wave. "I have returned to you." The Primarch who manifested before them was recognizably Fulgrim, yet transformed beyond anything his gene sons could have imagined. His flesh seemed to be crafted from living starlight, shifting between states of matter as though the boundaries between energy and substance held no meaning for him. His eyes burned with fires that had been kindled in the space between dimensions, while his voice carried the authority of someone who had walked through death and emerged victorious on the other side. "My lord," Tarvitz whispered, his voice thick with emotions too complex for words. "We thought you were dead. We mourned you as lost." Fulgrim's transformed features softened with something approaching his old affection for his loyal captain. "I was dead, in all the ways that matter. Yet death, I discovered, is not always the end of the story. Sometimes it is merely the price we pay for the chance to begin again." The reunion with his scattered legion was both triumph and tragedy, for time had taken its toll on those who had followed him into exile. Many had fallen in the years since his sacrifice, their names added to the roll of honor that Tarvitz kept carved into his own armor. Others had been corrupted, despite their best efforts, the constant exposure to chaos finally wearing down defenses that had held firm for so long. Yet those who remained were tempered by suffering into something harder and more precious than any metal forged in mortal flames. Word of Fulgrim's return spread through both loyalist and traitor forces like wildfire, carrying with it implications that threatened to reshape the entire balance of the heresy. To his scattered sons, he was proof that redemption was possible even for the most fallen. To the other traitor Primarchs, he was a threat that had to be eliminated before his example inspired others to follow his path. To the Imperium, he was a paradox that defied easy categorization, neither fully loyal nor completely damned. The confrontation came on the orbital platform above Molech, where Imperial forces had gathered to defend one of the Emperor's most closely guarded secrets. Fulgrim approached under a flag of parley, his transformed presence causing reality itself to bend around him as he materialized in the command center, where Rogel Dawn waited with a contingent of Imperial fists. "Brother," Dawn said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed too much betrayal to trust easily. "You appear changed from when last we met." Fulgrim nodded, understanding the careful distance in his brother's words. "I am not what I once was, Rogel, nor am I what I was forced to become. I am something new, something that has learned the price of redemption and chosen to pay it willingly." The Praetorian's amber eyes studied the transformed Primarch with the intensity of someone evaluating a potential threat. "Your legion has been declared traitoris perdita. Your name is synonymous with heresy and corruption. What makes you think the Imperium would welcome your return?" "I do not expect welcome," Fulgrim replied, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself vibrate with power. "I expect only the chance to earn what can never simply be given. Forgiveness is not owed to me, but perhaps service in its pursuit might begin to balance the scales of what was lost." The debate that followed stretched across hours, with astropathic communications linking the orbital platform to Terra itself. When the Emperor's response finally came, it carried a weight that pressed against the consciousness of every psyker within 100 light-years. The Master of Mankind had felt his lost son's transformation across the gulf of space and time, recognizing both the genuine nature of his redemption and the impossibility of simply forgetting the past. "My son," the Emperor's words reached them through layers of psychic transmission that left the air crackling with residual energy. "I feel the sincerity of your transformation and acknowledge the price you have paid for it. Yet the damage you caused in your fallen state cannot be undone by good intentions alone. You seek redemption, but the Imperium requires more than seeking. It requires proof written in deeds that span centuries." Fulgrim bowed his transformed head, accepting the judgment he had expected. "I understand, Father. I ask only for the chance to begin that proof, however long it may take to complete." "Then you shall have it," the Emperor replied, his mental voice carrying both sorrow and hope in equal measure. "But not within the borders of the Imperium you helped to wound. Your path to redemption lies beyond our current reach, in the dark places where corruption festers and innocents suffer. Prove your change by fighting what you once served, and perhaps someday you may again call yourself truly loyal." The isolation that followed was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Fulgrim's redemption, for it required him to accept that transformation alone was not enough. His loyal sons were granted conditional amnesty, allowed to serve the Imperium as a penitent brotherhood under strict observation, yet their gene father was denied that grace, marked as too dangerous and too compromised to be trusted, despite the sincerity of his change. As Fulgrim departed from Imperial space, his transformed essence burning like a fallen star against the darkness between worlds, he carried with him the knowledge that redemption was not a destination, but an endless journey. He had been reborn as something unprecedented, a being that embodied the possibility of change even for the most corrupted souls. Yet that transformation had also marked him as forever apart from both the mortal realm he had once called home and the immortal brotherhood he had lost to his own failures. The Primarch, who had returned from death, was not the same being who had fallen to Slaanesh's whispers on a forgotten world. He was something new and strange, a phoenix risen from the ashes of his own corruption. Yet phoenixes, he reflected, as he set course for the dark places beyond Imperial reach, were destined to burn alone until the galaxy itself was ready for the light they carried. The war for his soul was over, but the war for his redemption had only begun. And in the darkness between stars, where hope was the rarest currency and corruption the most common plague, Fulgrim began the long work of proving that even the most fallen could rise again if they were willing to pay the price in solitude and service that stretched across eternities. His return had shaken the foundations of what everyone believed possible, but it had also isolated him from everything he had once held dear. The Phoenix was reborn, but it would fly alone until the universe itself was ready to accept that redemption was possible for all who truly sought it. The Eye of Terror was a wound in reality that had festered for 10,000 years, a realm where the laws of physics bent to the whims of entities that thrived on mortal suffering. It was here, in the heart of chaos itself, that Fulgrim chose to begin his crusade of redemption. The transformed Primarch moved through the swirling maelstrom of corrupted space like an avatar of purifying flame, his very presence causing the warp stuff around him to recoil in recognition of something that had chosen light over darkness. His first target was a pleasure world called Lithia, where Slaanesh cultists had built a paradise of excess that fed on the souls of 1 billion enslaved mortals. The planet's surface was covered with cities of impossible beauty, their spires reaching toward skies painted in colors that had no names in any sane language. Yet beneath that artificial splendor lay horrors that would have driven lesser beings to madness, a network of suffering so profound that it served as a beacon for demons seeking entry into the material realm. Captain Tarvitz stood beside his transformed gene-father on the observation deck of their commandeered vessel, watching through the viewport as Lithia rotated below them like a jeweled cancer. The loyal Emperor's children who had followed Fulgrim into exile had been changed by their years in the warp's embrace, their armor bearing wards and sanctifications that blazed with power, drawn from their Primarch's transformed essence. "My lord," Tarvitz said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed too much corruption to trust in easy victories. "The cult presence is massive. Even with our advantages, a direct assault would be costly beyond measure." Fulgrim nodded, his eyes burning with fires that belonged to no earthly source. The years since his exile had taught him patience, the understanding that redemption was not achieved through grand gestures, but through countless small acts of defiance against the darkness. "We do not fight to conquer, Saul. We fight to liberate. The difference will determine our tactics." The assault began not with orbital bombardment or drop pod insertions, but with something far more insidious. Fulgrim reached out with senses that extended beyond the physical realm, touching the minds of the enslaved mortals on Lithia's surface. Where once he had used such abilities to corrupt and seduce, now he offered something the planet's inhabitants had not felt in generations: hope. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the Slaanesh cultists. Across their paradise of excess, slaves began to remember what they had been before their capture. The artificial euphoria that had kept them docile cracked like poorly tempered glass, replaced by a burning desire for freedom that no amount of chemical conditioning could suppress. Uprisings erupted in 12 cities simultaneously, guided by a psychic beacon that called them toward liberation rather than servitude. Yet the cult's response was swift and merciless. Greater demons materialized in clouds of scented mist, their forms shifting between beauty and horror as they sought to restore order through the application of exquisite torment. The pleasure palaces became abattoirs where excess took on new and terrible meanings, as the Dark Prince's servants demonstrated why rebellion against their rule was considered the ultimate folly. It was then that Fulgrim and his demon hunters struck, not as conquerors seeking to claim the world for their own purposes, but as liberators come to break chains that had bound millions in suffering. The transformed Primarch moved through the battle like a force of nature made manifest, his presence causing reality itself to recoil from the demons that sought to bar his path. The sight of him in battle was both terrifying and beautiful, a being who had transcended mortal limitations while retaining the core of what had made him human. Where his hands touched corrupted matter, it burned away like mist before the dawn. Where his voice spoke words of liberation, the psychic bonds that held slaves in thrall shattered like crystal struck by lightning. "You were mine once," hissed a keeper of secrets that manifested in the grandest of Lithia's pleasure palaces, its form a mockery of perfect beauty twisted into something obscene. You bore my mark willingly, revelled in the gifts I offered. What makes you think you can stand against your former mistress now?" Fulgrim's response was not words but action, his transformed essence striking the demon with force that sent shockwaves through dimensions that had no names. "I was never yours," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the very air sing with power. "I was confused, corrupted, lost, but I was never truly yours, and you are learning the cost of that mistake." The battle that followed shook Lithia to its foundations, reality bending around the conflict between a being who had chosen redemption and a creature that embodied everything he had rejected. Yet for all its power, the demon found itself facing something it had never encountered, a soul that had walked through corruption and emerged stronger for the experience. When the Keeper of Secrets finally fell, its death scream echoing across dimensions, the planet's liberation was complete. The survivors emerged from their hiding places to find a world stripped of its artificial beauty, but free of its deeper corruption. Where once pleasure palaces had stood, now there were only ruins and the promise of honest rebuilding. The news of Lithia's liberation spread through both chaos and imperial space like wildfire, carrying implications that neither side was fully prepared to address. To the slaves who had been freed, Fulgrim was a savior, whose very existence proved that redemption was possible. To the chaos cults that had lost a major stronghold, he was a threat that had to be eliminated before his example inspired others to follow his path. The imperial response was more complex, a mixture of hope and suspicion that reflected the impossible nature of Fulgrim's transformation. Some saw his actions as proof that even the most fallen could find their way back to the light, while others worried that his crusade was merely a more sophisticated form of corruption designed to lure the faithful into complacency. Lord Commander Macarius, leading the imperial response to reports of the liberation, found himself facing a dilemma that had no easy resolution. "A traitor Primarch fights against chaos in the eye of terror," he said to his assembled staff officers, his voice heavy with the weight of impossible decisions. "Do we trust his apparent redemption, or do we assume this is some elaborate trap?" The debate that followed would rage for years, with no clear answer emerging from the theological and strategic implications of Fulgrim's crusade. Yet while the Imperium argued over doctrine and precedent, the transformed Primarch continued his work in the dark places beyond their reach, fighting battles that few would ever know about against enemies that threatened the very fabric of reality. Each victory came at a cost that was measured not just in casualties, but in the grinding toll of fighting against forces that had once claimed him as their own. The daemon hunters who followed him were marked by their service, their souls bearing scars that would never fully heal. Yet they persisted, driven by the knowledge that their Gene Father's redemption was not just a personal journey, but a beacon of hope for all who had fallen into darkness. In the years that followed Lithia's liberation, Fulgrim's crusade would spread to 100 worlds, each one a small victory against the corruption that had claimed so much of the galaxy. He was no longer the perfect prince who had once sought to embody an impossible ideal, nor was he the corrupted monster who had served as Slaanesh's champion. He had become something new, a being who understood that true perfection lay not in the absence of flaws, but in the endless struggle to overcome them. The hunt would continue for as long as corruption existed in the galaxy, a personal war waged by someone who had learned the true cost of redemption and chosen to pay it regardless of the price. In the dark places where hope was the rarest currency, Fulgrim and his demon hunters carried a light that could not be extinguished, proof that even the most fallen could rise again if they were willing to fight for every step of the journey back to grace. The first of them came like ghosts, emerging from nightmares, broken warriors who had heard whispers of impossible redemption echoing through the warp's twisted currents. They arrived at the fortress monastery Fulgrim had established on the dead world of Pythos, their armor bearing the colors of legions that had fallen to darkness millennia ago. Word-bearers who had grown sick of worshipping gods that fed on suffering. Iron warriors who had discovered that eternal war held no meaning when fought without purpose. Night lords who had found that terror without justice was merely cruelty dressed in righteous garb. Captain Tarvitz met them at the gates, his scarred features reflecting the wariness of someone who had learned to trust slowly and verify constantly. Each arrival was a potential trap, a possible infiltrator, sent by the dark gods to corrupt or destroy what they had built. Yet each was also a potential brother, a soul that might yet be saved from the darkness that had claimed so much of the galaxy. "Why do you come here?" Tarvitz asked, a former word-bearer whose armor still bore the 8-pointed star of chaos, though the symbol had been carved through with deep gouges that spoke of violent rejection. "What do you seek from the Phoenix?" The word-bearer, who gave his name as Brother Hector, knelt in the ash that covered Pythos like a shroud. His voice, when it came, was thick with emotions too complex for easy categorization. "I seek what your gene father has found, a way back from the abyss, a path that leads somewhere other than endless damnation." Such scenes played out dozens of times as word of Fulgrim's crusade spread through the scattered remnants of the traitor legions. Not all who came were genuine in their desire for redemption, and the bodies that decorated the approaches to the fortress monastery served as grim reminders of what befell those who sought to infiltrate the growing brotherhood. Yet enough proved sincere that something unprecedented began to take shape in the eye of terror's heart. The penitent brotherhood, as they came to call themselves, was unlike any organization the galaxy had seen since the Great Crusade's early days. Warriors from different legions fought side by side, their past enmities set aside in pursuit of a common goal that transcended traditional loyalties. They were united not by shared gene seed or common origins, but by the understanding that redemption was possible for even the most fallen souls. Fulgrim stood before the assembled brotherhood in the fortress monastery's great hall, his transformed presence casting light that drove back shadows, both literal and metaphorical. The years of constant warfare had changed him further, each battle against chaos leaving its mark on his transcendent form. He was becoming something that had never existed before, a being that embodied hope in the face of cosmic despair. "You come seeking redemption," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that reached into the souls of those who heard it. Yet redemption is not something that can be given or taken. It must be earned through sacrifice, forged in the crucible of choices made moment by moment across lifetimes of service. What I offer is not salvation, but the chance to begin earning it. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of voices rose in unison, not in the ritual chants of the old legions, but in something new and unprecedented. They swore oaths that bound them not to any single leader or cause, but to the ideal of redemption itself. They pledged themselves to fight against the darkness they had once served, to protect those who could not protect themselves, and to prove through deed rather than word that change was possible. Yet their growing strength didn't go unnoticed by the powers they had abandoned. In the deepest recesses of the warp, where Slaanesh held court among pleasures that defied mortal comprehension, The Dark Prince felt each oath like a physical blow. Every soul that turned away from chaos diminished the god's power, while Fulgrim's continued existence served as proof that even the most corrupted could find another path. The attack, when it came, was unlike anything the galaxy had witnessed since the War in Heaven. Slaanesh did not send servants or champions, but manifested personally in the eye of terror. The god's presence warping reality itself around Pythos until the very laws of physics became negotiable. The dead world's surface cracked and bled, while the air filled with sounds that had no place in any sane universe. "You cannot hide from me forever, my former prince." Slaanesh's voice echoed across dimensions, each word dripping with honey and poison in equal measure. "You were mine once, and part of you will always belong to me. Return willingly, and I will forgive your momentary rebellion. Continue to resist, and I will show you torments that make your previous suffering seem like gentle caresses." Fulgrim emerged from the fortress monastery to face his former master directly, his transformed essence blazing like a star given form. Around him, the penitent brotherhood took up positions across the battlefield, their weapons blessed with energies drawn from their leader's purified nature. This would be the test that determined whether their movement would survive or perish in its infancy. "I am not your prince," Fulgrim replied, his voice carrying power that made the very ground tremble. "I never was, despite the lies you whispered and the chains you forged. I was a soul confused and lost, seeking perfection in all the wrong places. But I have learned the truth that you can never understand. True perfection lies not in the absence of flaws, but in the endless struggle to overcome them." The battle that followed shook the foundations of reality itself, a conflict between forces that represented opposing visions of what existence could become. Slaanesh fought with all the accumulated power of aeons spent feeding on mortal excess, while Fulgrim drew strength from something the Dark Prince had never encountered: genuine love for those he sought to protect. Around them, the penitent brotherhood engaged demon hordes in battles that would have challenged entire Space Marine chapters. Word-bearers who had once preached the glory of chaos turned their rhetorical skills toward inspiring resistance against it. Iron warriors applied their tactical expertise to breaking siege lines that stretched across dimensions. Night Lords used stealth and terror as weapons against creatures that thrived on fear, turning the dark god's own tools against them. Yet it was Fulgrim himself who drew Slaanesh's primary attention, the transformed Primarch, serving as both champion and symbol of everything the god sought to destroy. Their conflict transcended the physical realm, becoming a battle between philosophies that could not coexist in the same universe. "You offer them false hope," Slaanesh snarled, as divine essence clashed with purified soul fire. "Redemption is a myth, a comforting lie told by those too weak to embrace their true nature. I offer honesty, the admission that all sentient beings are driven by hunger, by want, by the endless pursuit of more." "You offer slavery disguised as liberation," Fulgrim countered, his response accompanied by energies that made the demon hordes recoil in recognition of something they could not corrupt. "I offer something you can never understand, the choice to be more than we are, to transcend our basest impulses through effort and sacrifice." The tide of battle turned when something unprecedented occurred. Across the galaxy, in the deepest dungeons of chaos strongholds and the darkest corners of corrupted worlds, souls that had been given up for lost felt a spark of something they had thought destroyed forever. Hope, not the false promises of the dark gods, but genuine possibility for redemption, earned through struggle. Prisoners broke their chains. Cultists abandoned their altars. Demons found themselves facing resistance from the very souls they sought to torment. It was a cascade of liberation that weakened Slaanesh's manifestation, while strengthening everything the god opposed. The Dark Prince's retreat was not defeat, but strategic withdrawal, a recognition that the battle could not be won through direct confrontation alone. Yet Slaanesh's final words carried promise of future conflicts that would span eons. "This is not over, my wayward prince. I am eternal, while you are merely persistent. Time favors my cause, not yours." As the god's presence faded from the material realm, Fulgrim stood victorious, yet unchanged in his fundamental understanding. The war was far from over, but something crucial had been proven on the battlefield of Pythos. Redemption was possible, even for the most fallen souls, if they were willing to pay the price in struggle that might last until the heat death of the universe itself. The penitent brotherhood had survived its first true test, emerging stronger and more unified than before. They were no longer just desperate souls seeking redemption, but a genuine force for change in a galaxy that had forgotten such things were possible. Under Fulgrim's guidance, they would carry their message to every corner of space where corruption festered and hope had been forgotten. The gathering storm had passed, but the light it had kindled would burn for millennia to come. The final test came not as armies or fleets, but as a single figure walking across the ash fields of Pythos, its footsteps leaving trails of corrupted beauty in the sterile dust. Fulgrim watched from the walls of his fortress monastery as the champion approached, recognizing in its perfect features a mockery of everything he had once sought to become. This was Slaanesh's ultimate gambit, not a demon or corrupted mortal, but something far more dangerous. A reflection of what he might have been had he chosen differently on a distant world called Lair. The being that called itself Fulgrim the Magnificent bore his face and form, yet perfected beyond any mortal limitation. Its armor was a masterwork that sang with harmonics drawn from tortured souls, while its blade carried the essence of every pleasure-seeker who had ever fallen to the Dark Prince's whispers. It was everything the true Fulgrim had rejected, given form and sent to reclaim what had been lost. "Look upon me, brother," the false Fulgrim called as it passed beneath the gates, its voice carrying the cadence of seduction wrapped in silk. "See what you could have become, what you threw away in pursuit of meaningless redemption. I am perfection incarnate, while you are merely a shadow clinging to faded dreams." Fulgrim descended to meet his doppelganger in the courtyard, where the penitent brotherhood had first sworn their oaths, the transformed Primarch's presence causing the very air to shimmer with purified energy. Around them, his loyal sons formed a circle that served as both witness and boundary, their weapons ready but their faces resigned to the knowledge that this battle could only be fought by one being. "I have seen perfection," Fulgrim replied, his voice carrying harmonics that made the false champion recoil despite itself. "It is not the absence of flaws, but the courage to face them. Not the pursuit of pleasure, but the acceptance of pain in service of something greater. You are beautiful, magnificent, everything I once thought I wanted to become. Yet you are also empty, a hollow shell wearing the mask of achievement without understanding its meaning." The battle that followed was unlike any that had come before, a conflict between two visions of what existence could become, fought with weapons that cut through more than flesh and bone. The false Fulgrim moved with grace that defied mortal comprehension, its blade striking with precision that could divide atoms, while its presence radiated seduction designed to overwhelm any observer. Yet for all its power, the champion found itself facing something it could not understand or overcome. Fulgrim fought not for personal glory or the pursuit of perfection, but for the souls who had chosen to follow him despite knowing the cost. Each strike carried the weight of every oath sworn in the Brotherhood's name, every life saved from corruption, every moment of hope kindled in the darkness between stars. "You cannot defeat what you have become," the false champion snarled, as its perfect features began to crack under the strain of battle. "I am everything you dreamed of being, every aspiration given form." "You are everything I feared I was," Fulgrim corrected, his blade finding its mark at last. "But I learned something you can never comprehend. Our dreams are not our destiny. We are what we choose to become, moment by moment, choice by choice, across lifetimes of service to ideals that transcend our own desires." The false Fulgrim's destruction was not dramatic, but quietly devastating. The champion simply ceasing to exist as though it had never been more than a reflection in troubled water. With its passing, something fundamental shifted in the warp itself, a ripple of possibility that spread outward from Pythos to touch every corner of the galaxy where corruption had seemed absolute. In the aftermath of that victory, emissaries came from Terra, bearing words that would have seemed impossible only decades before. The Imperium, after long deliberation and careful observation, had chosen to extend conditional recognition to the penitent Brotherhood. They would never be fully trusted, never welcomed back into the fold without reservation, but their actions had proven that redemption was more than empty words. "The High Lords have decided," announced Inquisitor Valerius as he stood before the assembled Brotherhood in their great hall. "Your organization will be granted autonomous status within Imperial space, authorized to pursue your crusade against chaos corruption, wherever it may be found. You are neither fully loyal nor entirely redeemed, but you have proven that change is possible even for the most fallen." The ceremony that followed was simple, yet profound, a formal acknowledgement of something that had been earned through sacrifice and struggle, rather than granted through mercy. Fulgrim knelt before the Inquisitor, not as a supplicant seeking forgiveness, but as a warrior, accepting responsibility for battles yet to be fought. "We do not ask for absolution," he said, his transformed voice carrying across the assembled ranks of his followers. "We ask only for the chance to prove that redemption is possible through service, that even the most corrupted can find a path back to the light if they are willing to pay the price in blood and struggle." The years that followed saw the establishment of Redemptor Vigilus, a fortress world built from the bones of Pythos and dedicated to the eternal war against chaos corruption. It became a beacon for those who sought redemption from the darkness they had served, a place where fallen souls could begin the long journey back to grace. The world's surface was covered with monuments to those who had died in that service, each name a testament to the possibility of change. From Redemptor Vigilus, the penitent Brotherhood launched campaigns that spanned centuries, their ships carrying the light of hope to worlds where such things had been forgotten. They fought not as conquerors seeking to claim territory, but as liberators come to break chains that had bound entire populations in spiritual slavery. Each victory was small in the context of the galaxy's vastness, yet collectively they represented something unprecedented, proof that the influence of chaos could be reversed. Fulgrim himself became something unique in the Imperium's history, a Primarch who served without official recognition, yet whose influence shaped policy across a dozen sectors. He was consulted on matters of chaos corruption by those who would never admit to seeking his counsel, his insights valued by minds that had no choice but to acknowledge his expertise. He had become what he had always sought to be. Not perfect in the absence of flaws, but perfected through the constant struggle to overcome them. The demon essence that still clung to fragments of his being would never be completely purged, a reminder of what he had been and the price of his transformation. Yet it no longer controlled him, no longer whispered temptations that could sway his purpose. He had learned to carry his corruption like a scar, a permanent reminder of the vigilance required to maintain his hard-won redemption. In the fortress world's highest tower, Fulgrim maintained a vigil that would last until the stars themselves burned out. From that vantage point, he could sense the currents of chaos flowing through the galaxy, the subtle signs that marked new corruptions beginning and old ones growing stronger. His awareness extended across light years of space, touching the minds of those who fought against the darkness while offering guidance to those who sought it. The Imperium had learned to accept him as a necessary paradox, a being who embodied both the possibility of redemption and the eternal cost of vigilance against corruption. He was neither fully trusted nor completely rejected, but acknowledged as something unprecedented, a Primarch who had fallen to chaos and found a way back to service in the Emperor's name. The war against corruption would never truly end, for the dark gods were eternal and their hunger infinite. Yet in the light that burned from Redemptor Vigilus, in the oaths sworn by those who chose redemption over damnation, in the example of a Primarch who had learned that true perfection lay not in the absence of flaws, but in the endless struggle to overcome them, hope had found a permanent foothold in a galaxy that had forgotten such things were possible. Fulgrim stood watch as he always would, neither fully alive nor completely transformed, but something new and necessary in a universe that required guardians willing to fight battles that had no end. The Phoenix had risen from the ashes of its own corruption, and it would burn until the heat death of the universe to ensure that others might find the path he had walked through darkness into light. There is no end to the vigil. There is only the eternal struggle, and the choice to continue fighting regardless of the cost. In that choice, redemption lives forever.